From Washington, D.C. to the heart of America, welcome to Mark Alford's America. I'm freshman Congressman Mark Alford from Missouri, and I believe in America. I believe in you, and most importantly, I believe that our greatest days are still ahead. You know, each week we get together, and I take you behind the scenes here in D.C. to share the stories, the legislation, the news of the day, and we also get to meet the great folks who are helping shape our great nation. Today, we're talking with Dr. Michael Faulkender, an economist who's making a big impact on public policy and economic thought here in America. As the Dean's Professor of Finance at the University of Maryland Smith School of Business, he's been shaping minds and guiding the next generation of business leaders. He also serves as the Chief Economist and Senior Advisor for the Center for American Prosperity at the America First Policy Institute. And that's the focus of today's conversation. Please welcome to our office in Longworth House Office Building, Dr. Faulkender. Good to have you with us.
Great to be with you, Congressman.
You really impressed me a couple of weeks ago. You spoke at the Republican Study Committee about America First and your 7-pillar plan to return greatness to America. Sometimes people, when they hear about America First, I think they get the wrong impression that it's America only. And we have to be strong so we can help other nations be strong as well.
Yeah, that's right. We are not an isolationist type of organization, but you cannot lead the world. You cannot implement American values here in the United States if we are not strong at home and take care of our challenges here at home. And so we absolutely assert global leadership. We recognize that there are threats abroad. We recognize that there are needs to bring in allies and like-minded nations to accomplish many of our, to meet the needs of the American people. So But the difference is that when we think about what's best policy, we start with, is this what's best for the American people? They're not just one of many stakeholders. They are the primary stakeholder when we think about the types of policies that we advocate.
You probably fly a lot, so do I. And when the flight attendant is giving you the instructions before the takeoff, they always say, if we lose compression or whatever, the oxygen mask drops out of the ceiling, you need to put it on yourself first before you can help your child or anyone else with you. It's kind of the same analogy. We have got to make ourselves healthy as a nation before we can help others.
That's right. If you don't have strength at home, then you don't have the wherewithal to engage in the activities around the world. So if our economy is weak, we can't have the national security that protects the Western world. And so we have to make sure that we continue to invest in our people, invest in our nation, and continue to grow our economy and generate the type of resources that will enable us to carry out our tasks globally.
And so you've come up with a 7-pillar plan to restore the American economy, to restore our dominance and influence on the world stage. And let's start with the first one, energy policy.
That's right. So when we think about meeting the needs of the future, our needs, the world's needs when it comes to energy are just going to continue to grow. We are going to have, if you think about some of the innovations that are taking place right now, so there's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence, for instance. AI is enormously energy intensive, but it could profoundly alter the future of our planet. And if we are not a leader globally in the innovation of artificial intelligence, then we are going to potentially find ourselves susceptible to Chinese leadership or European leadership. We have to be at the forefront of that. But that means generating sufficient energy domestically in order to meet the needs of that new industry. Secondly, energy security is national security. So you cannot, if you think about the way that the Russians are funding their war in Ukraine, if you think about the way that the Iranians are funding some of the terrorist activities against Israel, it is coming from oil money. But third and most importantly, back to America First criteria, energy costs, energy sources, they are at the forefront. They permeate every part of the American economy, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's transportation, whether it's production, whether it's agriculture. People are very much hurting because of the increases in food prices. And I would say that one of the biggest causes of the increase in food prices is the increase in energy. Because if you think about the energy that powers the tractor, if you think about the energy that's necessary to move that product from the farm to the distribution center, to the grocery store.
Fertilizers made.
And that's where I was going
to products.
I think that's one of the least understood pieces, is that a lot of fertilizer production comes from natural gas. And so if you don't continue to invest in the creation of all energy sources here in the United States, the price of everything, again, the food that we eat, the cars that we drive, all the goods and services that we use are highly dependent upon energy. And that means even as we think about expanding renewables, okay, the America First Policy Institute is an all of the above energy shop. But as you think about increasing renewables, that's not to substitute with fossils and nuclear. That is to add on to it. Our energy needs are going to continue to grow, and that means expanding all sources of energy, including fossil fuels, including renewables, and including nuclear.
What damage has this current Harris-Biden administration done by declaring a war on fossil fuels?
I'd say that is primarily the underlying source of the inflation that we have suffered over the last 3.5 years. So prices are up 20% across the board, but energy prices are up closer to 35%.
And yet she calls it price gouging.
Well, she said price gauging, but which just tells you that she actually doesn't understand it. And she seems to think that the way to go about it is to empower bureaucrats to go into local grocery stores in Kansas City and tell the local grocer what price to charge, rather than allowing market forces to operate. Grocers operate with very low margins, and if you look at the cost of their inputs, that has been commensurate with the prices that they're charging. Because they operate on such lean margins, they have had to pass on the price increases that they're suffering from.
One of the things that when President Trump first came to office some years ago, one of the first things he did was cut back on regulation. The overregulation is strangling businesses. We see it in the Kansas City market. We see it in the home building. It's just added the new regs that the Kansas City has adopted for home builders has added 23% to the cost of a home, and you add that to the increased interest rate.
Right.
There's no wonder people can't. And the builders don't want to build there because of the overregulation.
Right. If you look at the last 4 years at the national level, the monthly mortgage payment for the median priced home in this country has doubled because of the combination of the increased costs of construction and then the increased interest rate environment. The combination of those two things has meant a doubling of monthly mortgage payments. And that's why for many voters, for many Americans, housing affordability is the single most critical issue for us to address. And as you said, imposing greater regulations, making it more expensive for home construction to take place, putting in place restrictive zoning requirements that take a lot of land and housing availability away from the marketplace, that's actually going to raise prices instead of creating the abundance that we need. So we need to see what we can do at the local level, the state level, and the federal level to remove some of the requirements that are being put in place. And so, for instance, the Biden administration, they talk a game about bringing on more supply, but really they are likewise imposing through HUD green energy requirements on new housing construction that raises the price of that construction. And the problem that they've got, and I say this about nearly every sector of our economy, their strategy seems to be that the federal government somehow knows better how your industry should operate. So we're going to impose tax requirements, we're going to impose massive regulations, and then when the federal government breaks it, they then come in with demand subsidies. They then come in with, like Vice President Harris's proposal to provide $25,000 to every new home buyer. Well, all that's going to do is further raise the price. We saw that with the American Rescue Plan and then the Inflation Reduction Act. All of that did is create more inflation, because if you don't fundamentally alter supply and you just throw money at the problem, you don't increase quantity, you just increase price.
One of the pillars is getting control of our federal spending. As you know, roughly 75% is so-called mandatory spending. Congress, really, all we have to fight on is this 26% of non-discretionary spending, but everything else is wrapped up in Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid. Where do we go when it comes to federal spending? What do we need to be looking at?
I think you need to look at both discretionary spending and mandatory spending. Both of them have increased significantly. Let's start at the discretionary side. There was an enormous amount of spending, as I mentioned, just recently with the American Rescue Plan and then what they called the Inflation Reduction Act to massively increase federal spending. Again, you think about all of that regulation that the Biden-Harris administration has implemented. They've got a massive army of bureaucrats that they are paying then to implement it. So there are lots of places where we can cut back on the size and reach of the federal government and thereby recognize savings in the discretionary side. But we do have to talk about some of the pieces on the mandatory side. So for instance, both the Obama administration and the Biden administration have weakened work requirements on social programs. At times where we're in approximately 4% unemployment rate environment, where we have more job openings than we have job seekers, that is not a time for us to be providing generous social safety programs that actually discourage people from entering the workforce. And it's not just an economic argument, it's a moral argument. People get live more productive lives. They set better examples for their children when they are out there being part of the productive part of our economy. And we need to re-implement that as part of getting federal spending under control.
We've addressed 3 pillars of America First policy with Dr. Faulkender. When we come back, the remaining 4 pillars, extending pro-growth tax reform, that's huge. Making sure that we have sound monetary policy, negotiating trade that really helps defend America workers, and realizing a healthy America. You're listening to Mark Alford's America. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Mark Alford's America, where we give you a behind-the-scenes look each and every week at Washington, D.C., and introduce you to some of the folks helping shape our great nation. Today, we're talking with economist Dr. Michael Faulkender, the American First Policy Institute. Doctor, thanks again for being with us. Let's talk about tax reform. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is due to expire this next year. We've got to renew this. Kamala Harris does not want to renew it. What type of burden is that going to put on everyday Americans?
That's right. So most Americans, if this expires, would see their taxes increase significantly because, and this is one of the things that Democrats try to fool the American people at, almost everybody received a reduction in their taxes. It did not all go to the wealthy. In fact, if anything, if you look at the IRS statistics after the implementation of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the wealthy pay a higher percentage of federal income taxes than they did prior to its enactment. So it would mean the average family seeing thousands of dollars higher in federal income taxes if this were to expire. And it's because at every level of income, if you are paying federal income taxes, you saw a reduction in your taxes as a result of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And all of, like you said, almost all of those rate reductions, the doubling of the standard deduction, those things go away at the end of 2025 if we do nothing.
Let's talk about the Federal Reserve. We have a Federal Reserve Bank in Kansas City. What's wrong with the Federal Reserve? What do we need to change about our monetary policy and the way that it operates?
So if you look at the responsibilities of the Federal Reserve, it is to maintain price stability, it is to realize full employment, it is to supervise banks, and it is to make money on being the provider of the money supply. Unquestionably, over the last 3 years, they have failed miserably at 3 of those 4 things. We saw 40-year high inflation, we saw 3 of the 4 largest bank failures in the history of our nation, and we saw the Federal Reserve go from providing about $100 billion a year of a dividend to the Treasury. That fell by 99% in fiscal year 23 because of their failure at quantitative easing. And so we need to refocus the Fed back on its core mission. It doesn't need to be engaging in new ways of monetary policy that cause inflation, and it does need to get its bank supervision activities back to basics. Why are they using bank supervision to impose a radical climate and equity agenda and allowing banks like Silicon Valley Bank to fail in the process?
Is this latest rate drop political?
I believe it was, because this is the latest beginning of a rate cut cycle near an election that we have ever seen. We are still not back to the 2% inflation target that the Federal Reserve itself has set. We are not seeing significant reductions in employment. And so it instead seems like there was an attempt to try to improve upon the hardship many Americans are facing coming from high interest costs to start bringing down interest rates just prior to the election.
Let's talk about trade. Trade is so important. We see this in ag, opening up new markets. There's some provisions in the Farm Bill that we're trying to get on the floor in our lame duck in November that's going to increase trade. how important is the trade policies and this proposed tariffs that Trump is already talking about?
Right. So what President Trump has recognized is that when China, for instance, was granted entry into the World Trade Organization, they were supposed to abide by certain criteria, right? So there's not supposed to be forced technology transfers, intellectual property theft, illegal subsidies, currency manipulations, and yet many of those things were taking place. And so during the first term, President Trump asked Secretary Mnuchin and Ambassador Lighthizer to start addressing those issues, and he recognized that tariffs are a negotiating tool to get countries to address some of those issues. The World Trade Organization has failed to require its members to abide by the criteria under which those countries were granted entry. And if it's going to fail, then we are going to have to, through bilateral negotiations, address it. And so what President Trump has called for is something called the Reciprocal Trade Act, which says if a U.S. company sells into your country and you apply a tariff, we're going to take that same tariff and we're going to apply it to the goods and services that you bring into our country. And it's an opportunity for us to say, if you don't want high tariffs on the things you sell to us, then bring down the tariff rates that you charge on our companies and our farmers when they export. And so there's this notion of reciprocity really should be there. The manufacturers and producers here in the United States should confront similar economic situation when they're doing business in foreign markets as those foreign companies do when they come into our markets. And it's an opportunity for us to get countries that have been taking advantage of us for decades to force them to the negotiating table and address some of these inequities.
Your seventh pillar is realize a healthy America. Tell me about that.
Right. So if you think back to what the Affordable Care Act, what Obamacare did, is that it really empowered bureaucracy. It really empowered insurance company and government bureaucrats to make healthcare decisions. What we instead need to do is put more information and more resources into the hands of patients and consumers. And so rather than focusing on subsidies to insurance companies, we really ought to think about using health savings accounts and providing those resources directly to the patients. If they want to go with just a catastrophic only insurance policy and pay for everything else out of pocket, why can't they take their Obamacare subsidy and use it for that purpose? But if we're going to do it, we need to bring transparency into markets. We need to have site neutrality. We need to get rid of a lot of the games that the healthcare providers and the insurance companies have been playing as a result of the really messed up incentives that are in place under the Affordable Care Act. And so how do we empower patients? How do we empower individual consumers and bring some market forces back into the healthcare sector so that we can bring down prices? Because I think American people need to understand the two items in family budgets that have gone up the most in the last 25 years are healthcare and higher ed. And what do both of those industries have in common? They are the most regulated, the most government intervention industries in our nation. And this just tells you, if we go down the path of continuing the Biden-Harris regime of government intervention, you should expect those other industries that they're wanting to get into that same outcome, because government doesn't know how to run businesses. Businesses know how to best serve consumers. And so rather than having government tell you how to do it and jack up the price in the process, we really need to empower individual consumers and patients.
This overregulation in the medical world is causing consolidation. I see it out there. And we have rural hospitals, some in my district, with one-day cash on hand. The rural healthcare crisis in America is real. And a lot of it is caused by this overregulation, and they can't afford to keep up with some of the government regulations.
Yeah, because the thing, so doing my econ jargon a little bit here, regulation is, whether you're serving 100 people or you're serving 10,000 people, complying with that regulation costs about the same. And so if you can increase, if through consolidation, you can increase the number of customers you're serving and spread out the cost to a lot more patients or a lot more consumers, then the per person costs go down. Now, what does that therefore incentivize? It incentivizes consolidation. It incentivizes concentration, which then has its own problems. And so that's always what's funny to hear out of the Democrats, is that they abhor all this concentration, and yet they impose regulation that causes it.
Dr. Faulkender, before we go, what do you love about America?
I love that a kid from Sacramento whose mom never went to college and was an operator for the telephone company, and my dad worked for the Geological Survey doing water resources out in California, can rise to be an assistant secretary of the Treasury and serve our nation here in the nation's capital. The idea that you can, through a lot of hard work, rise up to a position to help my fellow Americans and like really see the potential of this nation realized. I don't know of any other country where just, a middle-class kid from Sacramento could have the life experience that I had.
Well, thank you for being with us. Thank you for listening to Mark Alford's America. We'll talk again next week. Until then, remember, I believe in you. I believe our best days are still ahead of us. And Dr. Faulkender, I believe in America.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks.